Welcome to our Adventist Clarity Project, and today we are continuing with our episodes on Walter Veith, and as part of this series we will continue with the topic on Bible versions and Walter Veith, and this is one of his big topics, and of course we are going to analyze many of his claims, but today we are going to focus just on that part on Bible versions. And so I will follow a very simple methodology. I will play for you some clips, and then I will comment on some of the ideas that he has been expressing in those clips. In all fairness, I think a person can change his mind, and the person that was speaking about something today is not the person that in 10 years will be saying the same things. And so I believe that I should start with the early versions of Walter Veith when he began to be a public speaker. And so we will start analyzing those, and as we move forward in the next episode, I will contrast that with what he has said today, right? Or in the last years. So before I continue with Walter Veith's arguments against the Bible translations and his favoritism of the King James Version and so of the Textus Receptus, I think it's fair for us to check the story of this Textus Receptus. And let me just make my case that, of course, on the surface, the argument that the Textus Receptus and therefore the King James Version is the best translation out there, the gold standard, and the rest are just poor translations, is compelling at first, right? The Textus Receptus has a long history of influence, especially because it served as the basis for the King James Version. But when we dig into the story of how this text came about, the story is a little bit more complicated. And we quickly find out that the Textus Receptus is not the pure, perfect text some people imagine, especially Walter Veith. So let's start from the beginning, right? Because I think this deserves a little bit more clarity. And as a parenthesis, I think my point is that no Bible translation is perfect. Because Bible translations are, at the end of the day, a good intention and a good effort by people to translate the Bible and make it available so that others who don't have access to biblical scrolls, most of us who don't have access to biblical scrolls, will have access to them. But in all fairness, all of Bible translations are not perfect, and of course, we can come back to that later on. We can trace back the Textus Receptus to a man named Desiderius Erasmus. This was a Catholic priest who produced this text. And so the first edition of this text was published in 1516. But here's the key point. Erasmus didn't set out to just print and produce the best accurate Greek text. The main motivation at some point of Erasmus was to produce a text quickly, to compete with another text that was being published at the time. So in April 1515, a printer named Frobem pushed Erasmus to produce a Greek Testament quickly because another project was coming up, the Complutensian Polyglot in Spain. And so Erasmus went to Basel in July, hoping to find manuscripts he could send straight to the printer alongside his own revised Latin Vulgate. And so the printing began in October. Notice this, in October 1515. And get this, the entire work was finished by March of 1516, less than 6 months after he started composing the Greek text. In other words, less than 6 months for over 1,000 pages that Erasmus was preparing. So even Erasmus later admitted that it was precipitated rather than edited, and there is a quotation from him. And because of this rush, the book was filled with hundreds of typological errors, And one famous scholar, Scrivener, called it the most faulty book I know. So, what manuscripts did Erasmus actually use to compose this test? For sure, not ancient treasures. So, in fact, none of them were earlier than the 10th century. So, for example, the Gospels, the Book of Acts, the Epistles, he leaned mainly on just two 12th century manuscripts from Basel Monastic Library. For example, the Gospel, the Book of Acts, and the Epistles, he leaned mainly in two manuscripts from the 12th century that he found in the Basel Monastic Library, both considered of poor quality. He compared these two or three others, but only made small corrections. For the Book of Revelation, for example, he had exactly one manuscript, also from the 12th century, known today as the Codex Reucellini. And here is where things get a little bit more concerning. The Revelation manuscript was missing the last leaf, like the last page. So it didn't contain the last 6 verses of the book. So Erasmus, instead, of course, of delaying the project to find another copy, right? Erasmus simply translated those missing verses from the Latin Vulgate back to Greek. That means that the ending of the Book of Revelation in the Textus Receptus, and so in the King James Version, contains a reading that never existed in any non-Greek manuscript. Yet, they became part of the King James Version and influenced countless readers up until today. So, and of course, this was not an isolated case. There are more examples. Erasmus let the Latin Vulgate shape his Greek text. For example, in Acts 9:6, where we read, "And he, trembling and astonished, said, 'Lord, what will you have me to do?'" This phrase is actually straight from the Latin Vulgate. It doesn't appear in the Greek manuscripts, but it ended up in the Textus Receptus, and then of course, in all the Bibles that were based on the Textus Receptus. So over time, Erasmus released multiple editions, and his second edition was in 1519, and this became the basis for the German Bible, the Luther Bible. Then his third edition in 1522. His third edition in 1522, Erasmus included the famous Comma Johanneum, or 1 John 5:7-8, which is a test used to support the doctrine of the Trinity. Erasmus first resisted to including this test in his Greek test, but then he ended up adding it. And the reason why he did add that test was because there was another test that out of a sudden was found at Oxford, and he included this test in the Greek New Testament. And this test probably most likely was a gloss that made it into the main test. So Erasmus later produced a fourth edition in 1527 and a fifth edition in 1535. And he refined tests here and there, and even he was using at some point the Complutensian polyglot, the very test that he was trying to compete with. But the reality is that his editions were never particularly strong from a critical standpoint. And the reason why the Textus Receptus became so influential was because of two reasons: timing and accessibility. His text was printed earlier, cheaper, and in a format that circulated widely and was readily available for many people back in the day. So later editors like Stephanus and Theodore Beza continued to make slight modifications, but essentially they kept the work of Erasmus intact. So and finally in 1633, the printers Bonaventura and Abraham Elsevier published their edition with the following claim, and that's how we get the title Textus Receptus. "Therefore, you have the test now received by all," which is a translation from the Latin. And so that's how the Textus Receptus became known with that name. So let's put all of this together. Walter Veith and others may insist that the Textus Receptus is the most trustworthy test, but history shows otherwise. It was rushed to the market and based on a very late and poor manuscripts filled with typographical errors, and in several places actually translated from the Latin Vulgate. It is important witness of the history of the Bible, indeed. But we cannot treat this test as the gold standard. As it were, the original Greek handed down unchanged, as some people claim the Textus Receptus is simply not accurate. And here is the takeaway. If we want to take scriptures seriously, we shouldn't cling to myths about perfect manuscripts or untouchable editions. Instead, we can thank God that today we have access to far earlier and far reliable manuscripts than Erasmus ever did, because he just didn't have those manuscripts. So with hard textual scholarship, we can get closer to text as it was originally written. And I think there is a far stronger foundation for faith than any myth about the Textus Receptus as the gold standard. And from my point of view, I think, again, no translation is perfect. They had good intentions, and the people who did them had good intentions. All of them, all translations, including the King James Version. But they are not perfect. And the reason for that is because probably no translation is ever perfect. Not only because we can discuss the test used for that translation in particular, but also because they are an interpretation of a language like Greek and Hebrew that today nobody speaks, because these are languages that are not in use anymore. Hebrew, the modern Hebrew, is slightly different from the biblical Hebrew, or the Koine Greek is different from the ancient Greek. So my point is that there are no perfect translations, but we can thank many scholars who have put a lot of work into creating critical editions that have helped a lot in having the most reliable test. And people can make actually their own decisions. Those critical editions often some footnotes that tell the reader why a decision was made or why a manuscript was used instead of another. And if the reader thinks that manuscript that was ignored was better, well, the person can use that manuscript. And today, an even better version with better scholarship and better technology is being produced at this very moment, and it's called the Editio Critica Major. And that one is about to come. I wonder what Walter Veith is going to say about that one. And I will talk about this latest edition in a later episode. So let's continue.
And there was a huge hue and cry about it. Now imagine that the Bibles that we have today do more than that, and nobody complains. Isn't that strange? Isn't that strange how we have changed? Dublin Review, 1881, by the sole authority of textual criticism, not in other words by the word itself, not what it says, but by textual criticism, these men have dared to vote away some 40 verses of the inspired word. This was early. Now, as you see, hundreds of verses are affected. The eunuch's baptismal profession of faith is gone, and the angel of the pool of Bethesda has vanished, but the angel of the agony remains. Till the next revision, the heavenly witnesses have departed, and no marginal note mourns their lost. The last 12 verses of St. Mark are detached from the rest of the gospel as if ready for removal as soon as Dean Bergen dies. Remember, I quoted a lot from Dean Bergen yesterday. When he goes, they said, well, they're going to change a lot more. And they surely have. The account of the woman taken in adultery is placed in brackets, awaiting excision. Many other passages have a mark set against them in the margin to show that, like forest trees, they are shortly destined for the critic's axe. Who can tell when the destruction will cease? That was in 1881, when they just started revising the Bible. Isn't that incredible? Well, let's see what the modern people say. This is what modern Bible societies say. Novum Testamentum Graecae, the German Bible Society, Stuttgart. What has that got to say? It says, when Eberhard Nestle in 1898 presented the first edition of Novum Testamentum Graecae, he had achieved a work of which the consequences were not only unknown to him at the time, but also to the Württemberg Bible Society that made the edition possible. If the Textus Receptus at that time still had a number of defenders, the science, note that, the science of the 19th century had, however, finally proved it to be the worst text of the New Testament. So the Bible, the Textus Receptus, that had stood the test of time until 1900, now suddenly was the worst text available. There, the editions of Tischendorf, that's the man who discovered that piece of rubbish in a waste paper basket on which all the modern Bibles are based since 1841, finalized edition of such and such and such and such, and Westcott and Hort came in 1881, controlled the field. But in practical terms, at the level of the university, church, school, the edition of the Textus Receptus was still largely used internationally, as for example by the British Bible Society until 1904. Irrespective of the changes, the British didn't change that easily. Only with the release of the Nestle text did the rule of the Textus Receptus come to an end here also. Much rejoicing in Roman Catholic circles that finally managed to destroy the Textus Receptus. The Encyclopedia Britannica tells us something about Origen. We'll see in a moment. The received text, the Textus Receptus, is the old Byzantine text with hundreds of copies in agreement. It was written in Koine Greek. Note that, written in Koine Greek, of which hundreds of words cannot be translated into classical Greek. The early church used Koine Greek manuscripts and rejected the Alexandrian versions, which were based on the corrupt versions which Origen and other Gnostic revisions. Now, the Encyclopedia Britannica tells us that Origen taught that Jesus was a created being who did not have eternal existence as God. So that's the basis. If you want to have an ecumenical Bible, you have to remove Jesus Christ as the sole Savior and as God. It has to be done. Well, what does the Bible? Which doctrine do you prefer? Those of the enlightened, initiated ones, or those of the Bible? Which God would you prefer to serve? The God of the initiated ones or the God of the Bible? I like this one. I like Jesus Christ. Let me tell you what Jesus said. John 18, verse, I hate this secrecy, this clandestine religion, this I know more than you story. Isn't it disgusting? I know the path and I don't care if you don't make it, you're just a catechumen. Well, let's have a look how they changed it, these initiated ones, to keep the truth away from the rest of the world. Which verses did they change?
In this part here, you have listened to Walter Veith express some of his concern about how they change the Bible and the Word of God. And quote some magazine here, the Dublin Review, to promote criticism against textual criticism. And of course, one of the things stood out for me in this first part, which I don't want to spend too much. It's just first thing is there is a clear hate, a clear disdain from the part of Walter Veith towards biblical or textual criticism, and a clear disdain for biblical scholarship, for scholars who do biblical research. Those two things are very clear in this part. And although I recognize that sometimes people who are experts in something sometimes think that they know more than others, that many times is not the case. But in any ways, we are talking about here of textual criticism. So let me just make some comments about textual criticism. And why is that important? Because I think that we sometimes miss the big picture of why textual criticism came about and why the need for this. So biblical textual criticism is the scholarly discipline that seeks to establish the most accurate and original test of the biblical writings by examining and comparing thousands of ancient manuscripts, fragments, and versions that survived from antiquity. And so the fallacy is because we just don't possess the original manuscripts or the autographs that the biblical writers wrote. What we have instead are copies made by hand over many centuries before the invention of printing. So these manuscripts naturally contain various, some intentional, some accidental, that accumulated during the copying processes. So that's why we have the need of textual criticism. The need arises from several realities about ancient manuscript transmission. And so some of those transmissions, they had scribal errors and variations. So even careful scribes made mistakes, skipping lines, misreading similar looking letters, or accidentally harmonizing parallel passages that they thought were of the same book. Some scribes also made intentional changes, or that they thought were corrections or clarifications that they were good. Sometimes those clarifications were put on the margins, and eventually those margins became the test with the pass of time. So there is a manuscript diversity, right? We have over 5,800 Greek New Testament manuscripts alone, plus thousands more in Latin, Syriac, Coptic, and other ancient languages. Although there are no identical manuscripts, sometimes they create interesting relationships to one another, because when you read them, they do differ in the ways they present the same text of the Bible. And so there is another problem, which is the chronological gap, right? The earliest complete New Testament manuscript dates to the 4th century, while the latest New Testament books were written in the late 1st or 2nd century. And we are talking just about the New Testament. For the Hebrew Bible, the gaps are even larger, because, of course, these biblical books were written way before the Christian era. So some textual variants affect doctrine or interpretation, making accurate reconstruction important for religious communities and biblical scholarship. And so because those changes sometimes they are very critical to maintain church communities' doctrines and beliefs, then there is a need to critically make tests that will be answering those concerns. And that's why critical editions came. Critical editions are, in fact, the best result of textual criticism. They normally possess a test that they adopt. The margin, we will have a footnote explaining to the reader why they chose this variant over a different variant. And they leave the footnote there. Sometimes for those who are trained in ancient biblical language and in the reading of ancient text to sort of discuss whether they think those changes are pertinent or not. So those are the critical editions. And so for Walter Veith to come and sort of make fun of textual criticism is rather interesting, because the reality is that we need textual criticism. We need this work, which is the reality of today. We don't have the autographs. We don't have the letters written by Paul. Those letters written by Paul were copy, and then copy, and then copy more throughout the years after Paul died and centuries after he died. And so essentially we just need a textual criticism to compare, right, each manuscript with another, and then sort of come with some determining factor to come with the best reading possible. And of course, this discipline has its weaknesses. It's not perfect because the process itself is very messy sometimes. So there are different difficulties in sort of reconstructing, but they do the best they can. I think I have been mispronouncing that name, and some people in the comments, thank you very much for that, have corrected me, and that's great. Thank you so much. Walter Veith, I think. If that's not the way, please somebody can tell me how to do it better. I want to assure here to those followers of Walter Veith who have followed or watched or listened to the podcast in one of our platforms, including here in YouTube or anywhere else, that my intention here is not to attack Walter Veith or his persona. I don't know him personally. I think he looks like a great person, and the problem is the claims that he sometimes make. And since he keeps making them, then I feel compelled to answer them, and that's the only reason why I do that. So again, I do not attack the person. If somebody feels that way, please you can leave it in the comments, and I will of course correct, because I don't think it's appropriate for me to attack the person when I don't know the person, right? But in particular, I want to refer to some of the comments here that I have received, and truly they show that Walter Veith continues to be a popular speaker, popular person in Adventist circles. And of course, people have, for example, suggested that Walter Veith is the best preacher out there. I will refrain to say that. I don't think he is the best. But whether he might be skillful in presenting. But I just, again, my intention here to discuss the claims of Walter Veith, to be critical about them, which I think is important for us to do, of any preaching that we listen to, or any video that we see on internet, or anybody that comes to our church for that matter. There are some other people who have suggested, for example, that I am Catholic. I am not Catholic. I am a Seventh-day Adventist. I am not Catholic. The other comments that I have received from some of the people is saying that, I am being used by the enemy to go against Walter Veith, and that I am not going to be part of the saints who keep the commandments of God according to Revelation 14. I am an Adventist, and second, I don't have any intention to attack Walter Veith as a person. I just want to refer to his claims. Also, I have received other advices from some people out there to just shut up. Of course, I will not do that. Thank you very much for the advice. I am not the best one doing this, probably, and but I have fun doing it. So there you have it. On what side are you? I am on the side of Lucifer or Satan or something like that. I don't think I am in the side of Lucifer. But I guess the Bible also advises us to be critical of things that we listen to, right? And I think Walter Veith has gone too far in some of the points that he keeps on making. And that's my intention here. Some other people, somebody else says, and I read it here, foolishness. Not sure why this pop up in my feed. Well, maybe you follow Walter Veith. and you hear his preaching. So I guess that's why this is linked to him. So that's why he's coming on your feed. So if you don't want this to happen, then shut down the comments or the history on YouTube. Somebody else told me, find something else to do. Thank you so much again. Probably again, I need to get better in doing this. And I am sorry that probably I am going against your favorite speaker or personality out there, Walter Veith, or one of your favorite. But like, my intention is not to make you feel bad about it. It's just to call attention to some of the claims that he does. And I keep repeating this again and again. Somebody said, you are deliberately obtuse, my brother. Probably I am. But give me the chance to show you my opinion. And then you can continue on with your idea that I am obtuse. Or that's okay, no problem. Somebody else says, are you an SDA critic? I am not an SDA critic. I just think that it's important for us to, again, receive critically things that we listen, especially when they are big claims, I think. Somebody else says that I am probably a Freemason. I am not a Freemason. I have seen lodges around my area, I think, but I've never gone into one of them. So, I'm sorry, not a Freemason. There is one here that I think I deserves a good answer. And somebody said he never claims exclusive authority as you state. He said he was giving access to some info others never get access to unless they are part of the secret society in question. That's exactly what my point I want to make, though. My first podcast about Walter, I was trying to suggest that he, of course, it doesn't say that he's a prophet, but sometimes he kind of acts like one when he sort of believes that he has, the true message and he's going to uncover all the evil agendas out there, right? So that's why I said, and I used that title. But of course, he never said he's a prophet, nor I think he's a prophet, nor the church has said he's a prophet, right? That's clear. But the actions, the ways in which he comes across through his presentation, sometimes comes across like that. And I don't think he has any intention to believe himself to be a prophet. But I think he believes that he has the truth, and he needs to uncover the reality of the world. And some of those claims are very problematic, in my opinion. So in my future episode, I will continue elaborating on that. Something else the person said is that you are attributing statements and claims to him he has not made about himself. And I am not saying he said those things, right? I'm just saying that he sometimes comes across as one. And I think if you pay attention to my first episode on Walter Veith, you will notice that. So again, that's all the comments I want to make. Again, thank you so much for those who left comments. But in any case, thank you to those who gave me some advice, and especially that person who told me just to shut up and not do this. And thank you, but I will continue doing it. I appreciate that. Good try.